The bright studio lights flared to life as J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States, stepped onto the set of one of America's most watched talk shows. The anticipation in the air was almost palpable as millions of viewers tuned in, eager to witness the high-stakes interview that had been heavily promoted in the days leading up to the broadcast. Vance, fresh from taking his oath of office, carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced challenges before and emerged stronger. His military background in the Marine Corps had ingrained in him a sense of discipline and resilience, qualities that would soon be tested in a way that even he had not fully anticipated. Sitting across from him was Marcus Bennett, the host of the show, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for sharp confrontational questioning and a well-known ideological leaning that often clashed with conservative figures. Though Bennett's producers had assured Vance's team that the discussion would focus on the new administration's vision for America, the glint in the host's eyes as he greeted his guest suggested an entirely different agenda. The stage was set for a verbal duel, one that Bennett undoubtedly believed he would dominate. From the moment Vance settled into his chair, it became clear that the usual niceties of pre-interview small talk were being dispensed with. The production team moved with an unusual tension, adjusting microphones and camera angles with quick, precise movements, as if preparing for a pivotal moment in television history. Bennett, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, gripped his cue cards with white-knuckled intensity, an unspoken signal that he was preparing for a calculated ambush. Vance, however, was no stranger to scrutiny. Having transformed from a vocal critic of Donald Trump to the vice president serving under him, his journey had been scrutinized by media outlets across the spectrum. He knew what was coming, loaded questions designed to put him on the defensive, to force him into either justifying every shift in his political stance or contradicting his past statements. Yet, rather than brace for a fight, Vance remained poised, his expression unreadable, his demeanor steady. As the cameras zoomed in and the live broadcast officially began, Bennett wasted no time in launching his first strike. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice dripping with artificial politeness, "let's talk about your remarkable journey, from being a Trump critic to now serving as his second-in-command." His phrasing was calculated, his tone implying hypocrisy rather than evolution. Vance, however, didn't take the bait. Instead, he responded with a measured smile, his eyes reflecting wisdom gained through hard-fought life experiences. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he said evenly, "because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." The audience leaned forward, sensing something different from the usual defensive posture politicians often took in such moments. Bennett shifted in his chair, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected turn. He had prepared for evasion, denial, or a feeble attempt at justification, but Vance had given him none of the above. Instead, he had reframed the question entirely, turning it from an accusation into a discussion about personal and national growth. It was a subtle but powerful move, one that signaled to both Bennett and the audience that this interview was not going to unfold as expected. Vance wasn't here to play defense. He was here to lead the conversation. Vance's strategy became evident the moment he opened his mouth. Unlike so many politicians who would have resorted to damage control or meekly attempted to reframe their past words, he embraced the question with an air of deliberate confidence. His measured tone, his lack of defensiveness, and the way he leaned slightly forward as if inviting a genuine conversation rather than a combative exchange, threw Bennett off balance almost immediately. "You see, Marcus," Vance began, his voice carrying the weight of conviction rather than calculation, "in America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information." The phrasing was careful, not defensive, but assertive, shifting the focus away from accusations of political expediency and toward the broader and far more respectable notion of intellectual growth. "When I criticized President Trump years ago, I did so from a limited perspective. I viewed things through a narrow lens, shaped by personal experiences and what I thought I understood about leadership. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw his policies begin to help the very people I wrote about in my book, the forgotten Americans." The moment those words left his mouth, the power dynamic in the interview began to shift. Rather than appearing as a politician scrambling to justify his political transformation, Vance had framed his change of heart as a story of enlightenment, a testament to the very ideals of learning and evolving, principles that Americans by nature respect. For a brief second, Bennett hesitated, the sharp edges of his next attack dulled before it could leave his lips. He quickly recovered, scoffing slightly, his tone laced with derision. "Growth and understanding?" he echoed, eyes narrowing. "Is that what we're calling it now? Some might argue it's just political convenience." He let the words hang in the air, hoping to provoke a reaction, to force Vance into a defensive stance. But Vance, far from taking the bait, simply smiled, a small knowing smile that suggested he had expected this line of attack all along. "You see, Marcus," he said, his voice steady, "what I find fascinating is how quickly people are willing to judge others for changing their minds when presented with new evidence. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the facts and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?" The question landed with an almost audible weight. For a fraction of a second, Bennett hesitated, just long enough for the audience to notice. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that he had been placed in the hot seat of his own making. His response came a beat too late, betraying the fact that he had not anticipated being questioned himself. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine," he snapped, shuffling his cards as if eager to regain control. But Vance had already exposed a crack in his armor. He had forced the audience to ask themselves a question. Why is it acceptable for anyone else to change their mind, but not for Vance? More importantly, why was Bennett so eager to discredit that change rather than acknowledge its validity? Sensing his opportunity, Bennett quickly pivoted, grasping at another pre-prepared line of attack. "Speaking of changes," he said smoothly, regaining his composure, "let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The audience tensed, recognizing the loaded nature of the question. Bennett had just stepped onto sacred ground, and he knew it. This was a classic political trap, forcing Vance to either distance himself from his faith to appease secular critics, or double down and risk being accused of pushing religious extremism. It was a no-win situation, or at least it should have been. But Vance had been waiting for precisely this moment. His eyes sparked with something just shy of amusement as he leaned forward slightly, exuding a quiet but unmistakable authority. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." The distinction was razor sharp, cutting through the false dichotomy Bennett had attempted to construct. Before the host could interrupt, Vance pressed on, his tone unwavering. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government." A ripple of approval moved through the audience, punctuated by a few quiet but unmistakable murmurs of "Amen." The moment had shifted once again, and this time it was Bennett who found himself struggling to regain control. "Surely in our modern diverse society," Bennett attempted, "we have to consider the dangers of mixing religion with governance." But Vance was ready. He raised his hand slightly, cutting off the interruption with the same respectful firmness he had carried throughout the conversation. "Let me finish this thought, because it's important," he said. The room fell silent, and he continued. "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions. Because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood that there was something deeper than politics at play." His words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. The audience sat in rapt attention, some nodding in agreement, others simply absorbing the unexpected depth of his response. Bennett, clearly unsettled, tried to pivot once again, desperate to regain his footing. "Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump," he said, his voice a touch sharper than before. "Your recent statement about him being God's instrument for America's renewal, don't you think that's a bit extreme?" He emphasized the last word, hoping to paint Vance as fanatical. But Vance was unshaken. "What I think is extreme," he replied smoothly, is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. He let the words settle, letting the implication hang in the air. But since you brought up President Trump, let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's discuss what's really happening in our communities since the inauguration. The effect was immediate. The room, which had been teetering on the edge of a media-driven spectacle, suddenly found itself engaged in something far more substantial. Vance had not only deflected the attack, he had redirected the conversation entirely. What had started as an attempt to corner him had transformed into a discussion about governance, faith, and the values that truly mattered to everyday Americans. And in doing so, he had demonstrated the very thing Bennett had hoped to undermine: strength, conviction, and the ability to stand firm in the face of pressure. Bennett's attempt to corner J.D. Vance on matters of faith, values, and patriotism was a carefully calculated move, designed to paint him as an out-of-touch religious hardliner in an increasingly secular political landscape. But if Bennett thought he had found a weak spot, he was about to realize just how mistaken he was the moment he brought up Vance's remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast, implying that divine guidance in government was a dangerous breach of the separation between church and state. Vance saw the opportunity to not just defend himself, but to make a powerful statement about the role of faith in American life. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" Vance repeated, his expression composed yet piercing. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith, they were afraid of tyranny." The clarity of his response struck the audience, and for a brief second, even Bennett hesitated. But before the host could cut in, Vance pressed forward, his tone steady and deliberate. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history, not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government. That's an important distinction, Marcus, one that too many people seem to forget." The murmurs of agreement in the audience were unmistakable, a ripple of approval that even Bennett couldn't ignore. He tried to recover, adjusting his posture, his voice edged with skepticism. "Surely, though, Mr. Vice President, in a modern and diverse society, we have to consider the dangers of mixing religion with governance." But Vance didn't let him finish. He leaned in slightly, maintaining eye contact, his expression unyielding yet respectful. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. When I was a Marine, nobody questioned the presence of our chaplain. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions. You know why? Because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood that there was something deeper than politics at play. We weren't praying for a political agenda. We were praying for the strength to do what was right, for guidance, for protection, for wisdom." His words resonated. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously. Others sat in silent agreement, absorbing the weight of what he was saying. Bennett, sensing that he was losing control of the narrative, attempted to pivot once more. "But don't you think that in today's America, the idea of leaders making decisions based on divine guidance could be alienating to people who don't share those beliefs?" The question, carefully worded, was designed to push Vance into a corner, to make him either defend an exclusionary stance or backpedal on his faith. But once again, Vance was prepared. "Faith, Marcus, isn't about exclusion. It's about principles. It's about the values that guide us, whether you call them faith, morality, or simply knowing the difference between right and wrong. Look at our history. Our greatest leaders, from Washington to Lincoln to Reagan, all understood that a nation without a moral foundation cannot stand. This isn't about pushing a religion onto anyone. It's about recognizing that strong leadership requires a sense of duty, of responsibility, of higher accountability. And that's something every American, regardless of faith, should be able to understand." The audience was no longer just watching a debate, they were witnessing a fundamental discussion about what it meant to lead, about the values that shaped America. Bennett, however, wasn't ready to let go of his line of attack. He adjusted his notes and leaned in, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "So when you say that America needs divine guidance, are you saying that those who don't believe in God can't lead effectively?" It was an obvious trap, but Vance's expression remained unwavering. "No, Marcus. What I'm saying is that great leadership requires moral clarity, and history has shown us time and again that moral clarity is often deeply rooted in faith. Does that mean a person has to be religious to lead? Of course not. But it does mean that as a society we should respect the role that faith has played in shaping our nation's principles. Principles like justice, duty, sacrifice, and honor. These aren't just religious ideas, they are American ideas. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was genuine, a response to the truth in his words. Even those who might not have fully agreed with Vance couldn't deny the strength of his convictions or the depth of his reasoning. Bennett, growing visibly frustrated, tried one final push. "But doesn't this all contradict your own past statements?" he asked, a last-ditch effort to regain control. "You weren't always so vocal about faith. Some would say this is just convenient rhetoric." Vance smiled, his demeanor unshaken. "Marcus, do you know what takes more character? Stubbornly clinging to old beliefs out of pride? Or having the courage to grow, to learn, to embrace a deeper understanding of the world?" "I've seen things, Marcus. I've seen how faith carries people through hardship. I've seen how values shape strong communities, and I've learned that some of the most important truths in life are the ones that don't change, no matter how much the world around us does." The words hung in the air, undeniable in their sincerity. Bennett, for the first time, had no immediate retort. The audience, fully engaged, had seen through the attempted ambush and instead witnessed a masterclass in conviction and composure. In that moment, it was clear Vance hadn't just defended himself. He had defined the debate on his terms. Bennett's frustration was beginning to show, but he wasn't ready to back down yet. He had tried attacking J.D. Vance's faith, only to have the vice president turn the discussion into a powerful reflection on America's moral foundation. Now he shifted gears, returning to the subject that had driven much of the media's scrutiny of Vance: his past criticism of Donald Trump and his eventual alliance with him. "Let's talk about your background, Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, his voice adopting an almost casual air, though the intent behind his words was anything but. "You've written extensively about your humble beginnings, your roots in a working-class family, yet now you find yourself in the highest echelons of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from." Vance didn't so much as flinch. His expression remained steady, his hands folded neatly in his lap, exuding the quiet strength of someone who had long since made peace with his journey. "That's interesting, Marcus," he replied evenly, "because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into the expectations of the Washington elite." Bennett's lips pressed together slightly, sensing that once again Vance wasn't reacting the way he had hoped. He tried another angle. "Character," he echoed, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump? You once wrote quite passionately against him. You didn't just criticize him, you condemned him. And now, here you are, sitting in the halls of power as his most loyal defender. What do you say to those who call that hypocrisy?" The trap was clear. Bennett wanted Vance to stumble, to justify himself in a way that would either make him appear weak or disingenuous. But Vance's response was calm, deliberate, and sharp. "I say that it takes more character to admit when you're wrong than to stubbornly hold on to a position just to avoid criticism," he said. The audience murmured, sensing the weight of his words. "When I first spoke against President Trump, I was looking at him through a narrow lens, the same way so many others did. I had preconceived notions, shaped by media narratives, by my own limited experiences. But then I did something that too many in Washington refused to do. I actually paid attention. I watched as his policies lifted the very people I wrote about in my book, the forgotten Americans who had been left behind by both parties. I saw factories reopen, wages rise, families regain a sense of hope. And I realized that I had been wrong." Bennett let out a short, incredulous chuckle, but it was forced, uneasy. "So, just like that," he prodded, "you went from calling Trump a threat to democracy to being his second in command?" Vance's smile didn't waver. "No, Marcus, not just like that. It wasn't an overnight shift, and it wasn't about political convenience. It was about something more important than ego. The willingness to acknowledge when reality contradicts your assumptions. That's what leaders do. They learn, they grow, they evolve, The audience was listening intently now, some nodding in agreement, others simply absorbing the way Vance was turning what was meant to be a personal attack into a larger discussion about integrity and leadership. Bennett, sensing that he was losing ground, decided to up the ante. He flipped through his notes before landing on the one accusation that he hoped would strike a nerve. "Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice carrying an edge of feigned concern, "you've built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans, and yet here you are, in an expensive suit, sitting in one of the most powerful positions in the country, defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony in that?" The air in the room seemed to shift. Several audience members sat up straighter, sensing the confrontation reaching a critical moment. But Vance didn't hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto Bennett's with quiet intensity. "You know what I see, Marcus?" he said, his voice level, controlled. "I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something. The values I learned growing up in Middletown, Ohio, don't change with your zip code or your job title. My grandmother taught me that integrity isn't about where you sit, it's about what you stand for." The applause was immediate, brief but powerful. Bennett, visibly frustrated now, pushed further. "So, you're saying your transformation had nothing to do with political ambition? That we should just ignore your past criticisms and accept that you've suddenly seen the light?" Vance's expression remained steady, but there was a new edge to his voice now, a subtle steel beneath his words. "What I'm saying, Marcus, is that you seem far more concerned with my past words than with my present actions. The real question isn't why I changed my mind, it's why people like you refuse to acknowledge that a man can change his mind for the right reasons." Bennett's jaw tightened. "That's not what I'm saying." "No," Vance interrupted smoothly. "Then let me ask you this. Have you ever gotten to know someone personally and realized that your assumptions about them were wrong? Have you ever had the humility to admit that maybe, just maybe, you didn't have all the answers?" The question hit hard. For the first time, Bennett seemed caught off guard. The silence in the studio was thick, the weight of the exchange pressing down on the room. Vance let the pause stretch just long enough to make his point before continuing. "You call it a reversal. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature the media likes to paint. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside him." Bennett's lips parted as if to speak, but before he could, Vance delivered the final blow. "You call that being a puppet," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I call it having the courage to stand by a leader who puts America first. And if that makes me a target for people like you, so be it." The room erupted into applause. This wasn't just a response, it was a dismantling. Bennett had set out to expose Vance as a man of contradictions, but instead, he had revealed something else entirely. A man who owned his past, stood by his decisions, and refused to be shamed for believing in something greater than himself. Bennett, now visibly flustered, glanced at his producer, who was frantically signaling to move on. He cleared his throat, shuffled his notes, and tried to regain control. But it was too late. The battle had already been won. Bennett's frustration was now impossible to hide. He had tried to paint J.D. Vance as an opportunist, a man who had abandoned his principles for power. But each time he pushed, Vance responded with steady resolve, turning every attack into a broader discussion about integrity, leadership, and the ability to learn from experience. Now, sensing that he was losing control of the narrative, Bennett decided to shift tactics again, moving toward the media's favorite weapon: framing conservatives as out-of-touch relics of the past. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett said, glancing briefly at his notes before looking up with a carefully rehearsed expression of concern. "You've often spoken about traditional values, about faith, about patriotism. But in today's America, don't you think clinging to those ideals is a bit outdated? Some might argue that those who refuse to evolve with the times are just living in the past." The words were laced with condescension, a subtle but clear implication that Vance and those who shared his beliefs were relics, stubbornly resisting progress. It was a familiar line of attack, one that the media had used countless times to undermine those who spoke about family, faith, and national pride. But if Bennett thought Vance would stumble, he was once again mistaken. The vice president's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, a flicker of steel beneath the calm. "Tell me, Marcus," Vance said, his voice steady, measured. "Do you really believe that millions of Americans, people who go to church every Sunday, who work hard to provide for their families, who still believe in the values that built this country, are just living in the past?" The question landed like a punch. Bennett blinked, clearly not expecting the counterattack. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but Vance didn't give him the chance, because if that's what you believe, Vance continued, his voice carrying through the studio with quiet intensity, then maybe the real issue isn't that traditional values are outdated. Maybe the real issue is that people like you, people in the media, have lost touch with the country you claim to speak for. A murmur rippled through the audience. Bennett's carefully composed facade cracked just for a second as he realized he had walked straight into Vance's trap. He quickly tried to pivot. "I wouldn't say that, no?" Vance pressed, leaning in slightly, his tone never rising but carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Then let's talk about the way the media treats people like me. People who dared to believe in something bigger than themselves. Just last week, Marcus, you devoted an entire segment to questioning my faith, suggesting it was nothing more than convenient election season Christianity. You went on national television and implied that my belief in God was nothing more than a political tool. Tell me, Marcus, is that journalism? Or is that just another way of trying to shame people for their beliefs?" The silence that followed was deafening. Bennett shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, but Vance wasn't finished. "You see, this isn't about me," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "This is about the millions of Americans who are tired of being mocked for their faith, tired of being told that their values are outdated, tired of being looked down upon by people who sit in studios like this and decide what's acceptable to believe." The audience was no longer passive. Heads were nodding, expressions had shifted. Even some of the production crew were visibly engaged, watching the exchange unfold with interest. Bennett, desperate to regain control, tried to interrupt. "Mr. Vice President, But Vance simply held up a hand, not in anger but in quiet authority. "Let me finish this thought. Because it's important," he said, his tone unwavering. "What you don't seem to understand, Marcus, is that the people you mock, the ones who still believe in faith, family, and country, are the backbone of this nation. They're the ones who build, who serve, who sacrifice. And yet, time and time again, people like you dismiss them. You roll your eyes when they pray, you sneer when they say they love their country, and then you act surprised when they stop listening to you." The last sentence hit like a hammer. Bennett was visibly rattled now, but he tried one last counterattack. "Mr. Vice President, aren't you just deflecting? The issue isn't whether Americans have the right to their beliefs. The issue is whether those beliefs should dictate policy in a modern democracy." Vance exhaled slightly, almost as if he expected that line. "Marcus, here's the real contradiction. You and your colleagues spend so much time lecturing conservatives about tolerance, about respecting diversity, but when it comes to people of faith, to people with traditional values, that tolerance suddenly disappears." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Respecting different perspectives shouldn't mean silencing the ones you don't like." The audience erupted into applause. Bennett, who had spent his entire career controlling interviews, found himself drowning in the reaction. His attempts to regain control faltered as the energy in the room shifted unmistakably in Vance's favor. He cleared his throat, clearly flustered, and glanced at his producer, who was now gesturing for him to wrap up or change the subject. But the damage was done. The audience had seen through the act. Vance had not only defended his beliefs, he had exposed the very bias that Bennett had tried so hard to conceal, and in doing so, he had won the debate not just in words, but in conviction. Bennett's frustration had reached its peak. Every carefully crafted question, every attempt to corner J.D. Vance had been met with a calm, steady response that not only deflected the attack but turned it into an opportunity to expose media bias and reaffirm the values that millions of Americans still held dear. But Bennett wasn't finished yet. Desperate to regain control of the interview, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if preparing for a final, decisive strike. "Mr. Vice President," he said, his tone carefully measured, "let's be honest here. Your entire political journey, from Trump critic to one of his most vocal supporters, has been a masterclass in opportunism. Some might even say you're nothing more than a puppet for the former president. What do you say to those who believe you've simply traded principles for power? The words hung in the air, a challenge meant to force Vance into a defensive posture. It was a classic media tactic. Attach a label, repeat it enough times, and hope it sticks. But Vance didn't flinch. Instead, a small smile played at the corners of his mouth, as if he had been expecting this all along. He leaned back slightly, exuding the confidence of a man who knew he had already won. "You know, Marcus?" he said, his voice measured but firm. "That word, puppet, says a lot more about you than it does about me." The studio fell silent. Even Bennett seemed momentarily caught off guard by the response. Vance continued, his gaze unwavering. "In your world, loyalty is something to mock. Standing by someone you respect is a weakness. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. In combat, you don't judge a man by what the media says about him. You judge him by his actions, by the way he leads, by whether he stands with his people when things get tough. And I've seen President Trump's leadership firsthand. Not the caricature that networks like yours try to create, but the real man who fights for this country." The audience, which had been listening intently, responded with a ripple of applause. Bennett shifted in his chair, clearly irritated that the conversation had once again slipped from his control. He attempted to cut in, but Vance wasn't finished. "You call it being a puppet," he said, his voice steady. "I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump because I've seen what he's done for this country. I've seen factories reopen, I've seen wages rise, and I've seen forgotten communities finally get the attention they deserve. And while you and your colleagues sit in studios like this, trying to discredit anyone who doesn't fit into your worldview, I'm out there talking to real Americans, the ones who don't care about media narratives, the ones who care about results." The applause grew louder this time, and Bennett's composure was slipping. He glanced at his producer, who was signaling him to move on, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He let out a tight-lipped smile and leaned in. "A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction here," he pressed. "You once wrote entire op-eds condemning Trump. How do you reconcile that with your current loyalty?" Vance exhaled slightly, as if he had been waiting for this exact question. "There you go again, Marcus," he said with a slight shake of his head. "So focused on contradictions that you're missing the bigger picture. The real contradiction isn't in my journey. It's in your refusal to acknowledge that people can grow, that they can learn, that they can judge a man based on his actions instead of past assumptions." He let the words settle, his gaze never wavering. "The real contradiction is in the way you and the media demand accountability from people like me, but never from yourselves." The room was silent now. Even the production crew seemed frozen, watching the exchange unfold. Bennett, visibly rattled, flipped through his notes, searching for safer ground. But there was none left. Vance had turned the ambush around completely, and everyone in the room knew it. Bennett had lost control of the interview, and he knew it. Every line of attack, every attempt to discredit J.D. Vance had not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. What was meant to be an ambush had turned into a platform for Vance to reaffirm his beliefs, challenge the media's bias, and remind millions of Americans watching at home why their values still mattered. Realizing he had nowhere left to go, Bennett checked his watch, forced a tight-lipped smile, and muttered, "Well, I think we're just about out of time." But before he could move to wrap up, Vance leaned forward slightly, seizing the moment with a quiet authority that left no room for interruption. "Yes, Marcus," he said, "I believe we are. But before I go, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home." The camera zoomed in on him, the audience silent in anticipation. "What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview," Vance continued, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about something much bigger. It's about the way people of faith, people who believe in family, people who love this country are treated in the public square. They thought they could shame me for my beliefs. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought they could force me to apologize for standing by the values that built this nation. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't just political positions. These are the principles that have sustained America through war, through hardship, through division. These are the values that have carried working men and women through the toughest of times. And they aren't going anywhere. A few scattered cheers rose from the audience. But Vance wasn't finished. He let the weight of his words settle before continuing, his voice unwavering. For too long, people like Marcus and the media elite have looked down on you. They've told you that your faith is outdated, that your love of country is misguided, that your belief in traditional values makes you part of the problem. They've told you that you need to evolve, that you need to apologize, that you need to fall in line with whatever new standard they decide is acceptable. But let me tell you something. You don't owe them an apology. You don't need their approval, and you sure as hell don't need to change who you are just to fit into their version of America. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Some audience members had risen to their feet, others nodded in agreement, and even a few members of the production crew seemed momentarily caught up in the moment. Bennett, sitting across from Vance, looked smaller now, not just physically, but in presence. The carefully planned ambush had crumbled, and now all he could do was sit and watch as Vance delivered the final word. So to every American who has ever been mocked for their faith, who has ever been told their values are outdated, who has ever been made to feel like a stranger in their own country, stand strong, Vance said, his gaze steady as he looked directly into the camera. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in. And no matter how loud they try to silence us, no matter how many times they try to tear us down, we're not going anywhere. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, even a few shouts of agreement echoed through the studio as Vance stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a quiet confidence that spoke louder than any final words could. Bennett, utterly defeated, barely managed a nod as Vance extended his hand. The host hesitated for just a second before shaking it, his expression one of thinly veiled frustration. As Vance turned and walked off the set, the standing ovation behind him seemed to shake the very foundation of the studio. The ambush had failed, the narrative had shifted, and in the end, the truth had won. In life, there are moments when we are tested, placed in difficult situations where others seek to weaken our beliefs and values. But the most important lesson from J.D. Vance's story is not about political debates. It is about how he remained steadfast, unshaken by criticism, and always put truth above condemnation. This reminds us that in an ever-changing world, holding on to core values, faith, loyalty, and integrity is never outdated. For those who have lived long enough to witness life's many changes, we understand that while times may shift, the principles of right and wrong remain constant. When faced with doubt or societal pressure, instead of retreating or compromising, we must reflect on the path we have walked, the lessons we have learned, and stand firm in our beliefs. As Vance demonstrated, changing one's mind is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to growth. We are not bound by past opinions if reality proves there is a better way. The key is to ensure that when we evolve, we do not lose ourselves, nor do we compromise simply to please others, but rather, we make choices rooted in truth and personal experience. Additionally, this story serves as a reminder of how modern media and society often attempt to impose their perspectives on others, pressuring them to think in a certain way. But as Vance pointed out, no one has the right to dictate what we believe or how we should think. Each of us possesses the wisdom and life experience to make our own decisions. For the older generation, those who have seen the world evolve through different eras, this message holds even greater significance. We do not need the approval of the younger generation or the media to validate the values we hold dear. Ultimately, the greatest lesson is perseverance. In a world that constantly changes, standing firm in our beliefs, unafraid of judgment or criticism, is the true measure of strength. As Vance said, the values that built America cannot be dismissed just because some think they are outdated. This is a powerful message for all of us, those who have lived, experienced, and know what is truly worth preserving.